Hey, what's going on everybody? This is G The Hypersapien, and in this video I'm going to be painting skulls. So just to speed things up, I already put a layer of Rhinox hide down. You can basically use any dark brown. This is just what I use, but you can obviously use a different paint company if that's what you prefer. You just want a nice dark brown, and you want to put down a few thin layers until you're happy with the coverage. Also with your dark brown, you want to make sure you get in all the creases. Obviously I'm using quite a big skull for an example, but you want to do the same thing if you're using it on small skulls. So you just want to get inside the mouth. Obviously this one doesn't really have a lower jaw, but you want to get into the eye sockets, the nose socket, in between the teeth and under the skull as well. So I make sure that I get it right in that nose cavity. And also, you want to make sure that you go around and get it under the skull to use as a shadow area. So now the next colour I use is a warm brown. In my case I use Mornfang brown. I really like this brown, it's really rich and really warm. It's basically like milk chocolate, but yeah, you can use an equivalent from a different manufacturer if you want, or if you want to follow the tutorial with the same colours to get the exact same result, go ahead. But obviously other paint companies, they have paints that are quite similar, but I use Citadel mainly, it's my go-to. So with this paint, you're basically layering on top of the Rhinox hide, but you do want to leave some of the Rhinox hide in the shadow areas. So basically in the nose cavity and a few other areas, you know, just pick where you think that the shadow's going to be and leave that shadow in there. So you do want to leave some of that Rhinox hide in the shadow areas, so when you go around, just make sure you leave some of the shadow area, but basically you want to layer this on top of that Rhinox hide, because basically building up from black, we're building up to a bone colour here, so this is going to help us build up to that bone colour. And again, you want to use really thin down paint. I use Lamium Medium in this, but you want to do a few thin coats just to get a nice smooth coverage. So as you can see, I've used the warm brown on top of the dark brown, but I've left some of the dark brown in the shadow areas, and then on top of that, I've got the warm brown. Now I'm going to start using a brown that's sort of leading into that beige bone colour. XV88 is what I use, but obviously again, you can use any sort of brown that you think will match this colour. Now at this stage as well, I am sort of trying to get familiar with the skull and all of the details, so I'm sort of going around and I'm just trying to work out where I'm going to leave my shadows and where I'm going to leave the highlights. So this is a bit of a playing around stage and just having fun with it. Now also I do try a bit of a stippling technique here. Later on I am going to glaze over this and obviously use brighter beiges or bone colours. But I'm just going around and I'm trying to get myself familiar with the skull and the detail and where I'm going to put the highlights and where I'm going to put the shadow areas, or where I leave the Rhinox hide in the shadow areas. So I wanted to use this as a skull tutorial from the Swamp Cooler Shaman from the Cruel Boys Warhammer Age of Sigmar range. Now this is a really nice model, but I thought being such a big skull, I can use this as an example, or use this miniature to do a skull video and sort of show you how I paint bone. But being such a big model, you can kind of have a lot of fun with it and do a lot more than you could on, say, a skeleton. So now I've had my fun, I stippled and I sort of played around with the skull a bit. We're back to business here. I'm going to start glazing, so this is basically more of an even thinner, thinned down paint of the XV88, and I'm just going to glaze it now, and I'm going to try to leave some of the Rhinox hide showing through just to create my shadows, but I'm using even thinner paint than I was originally here, just to sort of build and blend in all of those other colours that we previously did. And this is what it looks like after I've glazed it a couple of times. And I'm just going to go around and it's not an edge highlight, it's basically just going around the edges just to make them a little bit separated from the shadow area. But being such a big skull, I sort of experimented a little bit because on small skulls, obviously you don't have much of an area to work with, so the technique's slightly different. I'll probably do another tutorial for skeletons or small skulls, just so you can sort of see the difference. But I'm going around and I'm just going to highlight these areas, so where my highlight is going to be on the areas that the sun obviously hits, which is going to be on top of the skull that I'm doing here, but it's also going to be on where the cheeks would be. Obviously it's a skull, but the cheek area and basically the brow area is my main highlights, or the main areas that are going to catch the sun, and also a little bit of the teeth and a little bit of the nose, because obviously the sun's going to hit it from above but also hit it a bit head on. And you will notice that sometimes I change the brush, so just sort of take note of when I change the brush, but it's a bit obvious here. I'm using a 000 or a small fine detail brush because I'm going to start adding these areas, and I don't want to flood the miniature and get rid of those nice shadow areas that I've already created. So as mentioned, I'm going to go around the cheekbone, I'm going to go around to the nose, and I'm also trying to create details of little lines here and stuff like that along the teeth and the nose. So I'm trying to add a bit of detail and a bit of texture here, so you can see that I go along this nose a few times. You want to do it a few times just so it stands out. If you do it once, it might not sort of pop as much. Because I'm using such thin paint, you want to do it a few times just so it really pops. But you don't want to use it too heavy, the paint, too thick, otherwise it would just sort of not blend in nicely, in my opinion. So I'm just going around the edges again. I'm doing sort of little scratch marks or little dots and stippling on just little dots or lines. I don't want it to be sort of too uniform. So because it's a skull, you can have some fun, do some brush strokes, do a few stipples, like basically little dots is what stippling is, just little dots. And then you can do some lines. You can basically just work out how you want the model to look. Now I've got a bit of a bigger brush again, back to a sort of glaze this is. So I'm just glazing over these areas. This is just to bring all of the blends together, or all of the colours together. So if you use too thick paint, it's going to basically not show through the other colours that I've done underneath. So now we're finally onto our bone colours. I'm using Morghost Bone. I actually really like this colour. It's more of a new Citadel paint. Obviously, again, you can use similar colours, but I really like this paint. It has a really nice coverage, has a really nice colour, and some people use Xandri Dust as the skull colour. I find this is a little bit closer to what I want to use. So basically it's the same steps, and I'm just having a bit of fun with it. I'm sort of not doing bigger brush strokes with this. I'm trying to leave a little bit of texture behind. So every time you stop the brush, it sort of pulls a little bit or leaves a little bit of texture behind. So I was kind of liking that, but I'm basically going to go around really thin paint again, basically a glaze consistency, and I'm going to go over all of the highlighted areas that I did before and I mentioned before. So this is basically where the sun's going to hit and the brightest parts, but also you want to leave a lot of those dark areas with your shading colours. So to help everything blend together, I'm going to jump back a step to that XV88, and this is a really glazed, really thin paint, and this is going to help bring all of these colours together and help them all mesh together well. Sometimes when painting, I find you don't want to run too far ahead. You want to sometimes take a step back and use your last colour to help blend all of these together. Now you can see once it's blended together, this new Morghost Bone, or this bone colour that I've added, is really going to sort of mix in with those last colours quite nicely, so it's not sort of a huge jump from one to the other. So now I'm going to add our next bone colour, Ushanti's Bone. Basically I'm going to go around, and with this one I'm going to stipple on and just do little lines and dashes. This is, again, is in the highlighted areas, but we're not going to do as much we're basically going to do a little less than we've done before. So we're only putting it in more select areas. Now you can see this stray hair that I have. I take it off right here. But basically you want to, with the teeth for example, you want to put the highlight more towards the bottom of the tooth and then the shadow more closer to the top of the tooth. But we're going to go around those areas that I mentioned before. So the brow, basically the top of the nose and the cheekbones, and also obviously on top of the skull we're going to work that area. But these are all our highlighted areas, so we're going to work on them, and that's our focus here with these brighter colours that we're using, the brighter bone colours. Now you can see that it stands out quite a lot, but we'll fix that as we go along. But this is our areas that we're going to use the highlight for. You can see them quite nicely, they stand out, but also we'll blend that in as we go. So we're doing the bottom of the teeth is where the sort of the highlight will be, and then as it starts going into the jaw piece where the gum line is, that's where our shade will be, or our shadow area. But we're going to go around all of these areas. So now we're using our next highlight, our next bone colour. Screaming Skull is what I use. It's basically a bone colour similar to the last one, has a little bit more white in it. You don't want to use pure white, it's just going to look too cartoony. But we're going to go around and stipple and just do little dashes and lines around the same areas that I mentioned before. So you can see I do little dots or little lines along the teeth. We want to do this towards the bottom of the teeth again. This just really helps the shadow area pop, and then obviously the highlight area. We go around the nose and we do little lines and stuff around here that you've seen me do previously, just to leave a bit of texture and just to leave a bit of definition. Just so it's not a really flat piece, you want it to sort of have a bit of texture to these. Also, if you can see on the forehead, it had a bit of a crack going down this skull, so I want to leave the shadow in there, but I also go around the edges of that with our highlight colours, just to help that pop as well. But I go around the cheekbones. You just want to, obviously, make all of these areas pop. Now you see me going along the top of the skull because we want this quite bright, because that's where the sun's going to hit. That's going to be our zenithal highlight on our top-down view. So that's where the sun's going to drop. That's going to be quite a bright area. So as you can see, I've gone over that a couple of times with some thin layers, and now it's looking quite nice, quite bright. Now I do go back with my glaze. So basically this is a paint that's more of a glaze consistency. It's basically a lot more watered down. It's best to probably use medium, but you can use water. But it's a lot more of a thinner paint than I was using previously. And I'm going to go around and basically I showed you before with the XV88. I go around with a Screaming Skull just to help everything blend together. And speaking of XV88, I go around here just to add a little bit more shadow area to this, and just to help this blend into all the previous colours that we've added on now. So I'm sort of going around, this would be where the shadows are. Yeah, a little bit's on top, but it's also to darken, because we want our skull to look like it's aged, it's quite old. You know, it's not a fresh skull, this has been on his back for a while. So I'm going around, I'm putting it into all of the areas that I want just a little bit more shadow, a little bit more aged look to it. But as I mentioned before, sometimes there's a little bit of back and forth. So, you know, some areas were looking a little bit too clean and bright. So I came around with this wash or this glaze of the XV88, and I'm just going around and I'm just adding a little bit of more wear and tear to this skull. Sometimes when you are applying paint as well, you sort of think, wow, that's, you know, a bit too bright, but it basically blends in once it dries. It's not going to be as quite as bright once it dries. So you can see as the paint's drying, it sort of blends in, or it sort of mixes together quite well with the other colours. Now I do come in with our Rhinox hide, so our darkest colour, just to really sort of separate these teeth. You want to just take your time, you want to use your fine detail brush. I'm basically going around each tooth just to sort of make it pop and leave that shadow area in there. A couple of times it sort of does run down a little bit into the brighter area, so I just sort of quickly use my finger to get that up and out of there. But this is just really to make the shadow area stand out a bit, so even in between the teeth, sort of where the gum line would be, I'll go around and I add a little bit in there as well. So I'm using quite a thin paint here again, just so it helps to run into these areas, and also so it sort of blends itself into all of the brighter colours a bit as well. But this is what the skull looks like after I've done all of those steps. You can see some bright areas, some dark areas. You can see that it's a bit aged now. It's not sort of just really bright. Has a bit of depth to it. Now I do go around again with our screaming skull. This is just a sort of the finishing stage. This is just to add a little bit more detail. So I want to add a bit more texture to those teeth, and just any area that I may have missed, or just add a little bit more of a highlight. So now you can see our finished skull. Basically, it's got a lot of shadow areas, it's got a lot of wear and tear to the skull, it's quite bright on top. You can see the sides are quite dark where it comes into the light areas. Basically, you have fun until you get this sort of result that you want. But I'm pretty happy with this. It's basically a quick skull tutorial. You know, I didn't want to spend too long on this. I want to get my army up and going. But that's my video for painting skulls. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I have Buy Me a Coffee in the description box below. I have merch. I have affiliate links that you can use next time you check out, and I'll get a little bit of a kickback. But if you can't afford to support the channel, if you could please like, please subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a video. But also leave a comment. I'd love to hear if you enjoyed this video. But this was G The Hypersapien. I appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.